Hey everyone, it's Nick from Splice, and today we are honoring the last season of Game of Thrones by turning a very cute dog bark into a dragon roar. One of our lead designers was kind enough to let us book his dog Zoe for some studio time. Let's take a listen to the original barks. Now let's hear the dragon roar. For this project, I used Ableton 10 and a few third-party plugins. Be sure to download the project, linked in the description below. Alright, so my main strategy was to pitch the samples down because Zoe is not a big dog, and to use dynamic plugins like multiband dynamics, EQ, and some compression to sculpt the sound. Let's start here. I had this first group called Gurgles, and let's hear it. Now, the first, this pre-roar gurgle is actually from her bark here. Let's hear it. This is the original bark. And let's hear it back in its original pitch. So this is at C-1. If you use Shift arrow key up, you can quickly change octaves in Ableton. And it's actually looping because, again, she's doing these short barks, so I have sustain mode on, which means it's going to go forward, and then when it hits the end loop marker, it's going to return and just kind of ping pong back and forth. And let's go back down to that lower pitch. Now, the other really important tool I was referring to is multiband dynamics. Let's hear it without the multiband dynamics. And yeah, what I'm using upward expansion right here, meaning I'm taking the loudest points and I'm actually making them louder. I'm increasing the dynamic range, but this is really useful for getting the kind of the higher end of the gurgle or the, so that it's a little more audible. We'll make a video more about multiband dynamics in the future, but the overall gist of it is that it can do downward compression, which means it's taking the loudest points and making them softer, lowering the dynamic range, and upward compression, which means it's taking the softest points and making them louder, also lowering the dynamic range. As well as upward expansion, which means taking the loudest points, making them louder, increasing the dynamic range, or downward expansion, which finally means making the softest points even softer, which also increases the dynamic range. And it can do it between these three frequency bands that you can set. Again, that's a very brief overview, but it's a very powerful tool for sculpting the sound, and it's generally traditionally used on mastering chains, but is very good for sound design, especially when it comes to changing a sound drastically from its original sound. Cool. So the other gurgle is also this one's actually from Zoe's cute little whine right here. And let's hear this at its original pitch. Same technique of looping it. This time I used a little saturator. And I actually used downward compression, which is downward compression is just regular compression. So I use compression in the middle band here. Saturator is also to just give some color to the higher mid frequencies. And that again sounds, when it's all the way down to C-1, use Shift arrow key down. Just a little moaning. Like warming up the vocal cords in my mind. And then these lip flaps track. Never thought I would have a track called lip flaps. That is from Zoe's little growl or snarl, which, yeah, that kind of just naturally just, I think, is transposed. Yeah, negative 30 semitones, yeah. Breathing in before the main roar. And then lastly, there's a little roar release. And yeah, I think that's just a little multi-band dynamics. Just time stretched slightly, which we'll get into for the main roar. That's from the second bark. I have the main roar in a group here, and in Ableton 10, they introduced groups within groups, which was one of my favorite features. This is really useful for organizational purposes, as well as mixing purposes, since I have all these effects on all of these layers. So let's take a look at the first layer. Need to be time stretched because Zoe's bark's pretty short, and you would hope a dragon is roaring a little bit longer. So let me show you on the second bark, which is the bark I used for that, how that process kind of started. And it's a lot of trial and error, especially when you're trying to sound design something as like a dragon roar. But essentially you can hold Option and drag a little transient of the roar, or this bark. And once I have this here, I can also maybe pitch it down. And actually, before I pitch it down, I want to turn on warp. So I'm going to turn on warp, keep the original timing. Main reason is now when I time stretch, go to Complex Pro. So you can hear that. That's pretty, now more of a beast. And if I hold shift and I time stretch as far as I can go here, which is pretty time stretch, a cool trick is if you consolidate using Command J or Control J on Windows. Now I can hold shift and expand it even further. Now it is on beats, so that's why you heard that pulsating. Let's try it. So this is a really fun sound design trick. You can do this on like a piano note, some percussion, and just kind of keep holding shift and stretching it. Kind of too long for this, but as soon as you hit the limit, try consolidating, Command J, and stretch even further. Let's see. This is really going to start to get some uncharted territory. So that was a little over-exaggerated for the demonstration purposes. For all of these, they're not that long. I'm going to mute this track. Now, that was kind of the first part, but then the second part is kind of filtering or using EQ or multi-band dynamics to make sure all the layers work together. So this is the low gurgle here. Second low gurgle, which kind of complements it. Very complementary. So the next kind of really unique layer is this mid harmonics, but using the EQ8 really to only cut out that middle section to here. The main high harmonics I use Neutron 2 to emphasize the transients. Transient shaper is a really useful tool for sculpting how the sound kind of comes in, or the transient of the waveform. And this gives it a little more punch and gives a little more aggression. And this is kind of the reptilian part, I think, of the roar in my mind. So these high harmonics just kind of layer in, and on this one I have a Devastor 2, which gives it just a little color. So it's really subtle, but you can hear a little more high end. And then these two high harmonics are also just there to kind of support. Give a little haunting sound to me. Yeah, but they're really should be buried by the lower fundamental of the roar. So yeah, that's the main roar broken down. And the group has a lot of effects to kind of sculpt the sound. Let's just hear what it would sound like without the multiband dynamics. So I'm going to Command G, group these effects so that I can turn them all off together by doing that right here on the effect. So you can hear this with the layers, but the multiband dynamics and the compression really make it really like upfront. So yeah, I really encourage you to either sample your own dog or download the project and use Zoe Spark and try this for yourself. It's a great production challenge, and it will definitely build your sound design chops. Thanks again for watching, and stay tuned for more videos. Until next time.